The dust hadn't even settled on Clara Bennett's father's grave when the bank came calling with papers that said everything she'd ever known now belonged to them. She stood behind the general store in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, on a sweltering afternoon in July of 1878, pressing her back against the weathered wooden planks as tears streamed down her face. The heat made everything worse, turning her mourning dress into a suffocating prison of black fabric that clung to her skin. Her father had been gone only 3 weeks, taken by pneumonia that swept through town like a thief in the night. Now she had nothing. No family, no home, no prospects. The banker, Mr. Dalton, had looked at her with such cold indifference when he'd told her she had until the end of the week to vacate the small house on the edge of town. Her father's debts, he'd said, were substantial. The cattle ranch he'd been trying to build for 15 years was worthless now. The livestock already sold off to cover what was owed. Clara was 22 years old and utterly alone in a territory that had little sympathy for women without protection or means. She tried to hold herself together while walking down Main Street, but the moment she'd turned behind Patterson's general store, the sobs had broken free. She buried her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief and fear. "Ma'am." The voice startled her so badly she gasped, her head snapping up. Through her tears, she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. As he stepped closer, moving into the shade of the building's overhang, she could make out more details. He was a cowboy, that much was clear from his worn leather chaps, dusty boots with spurs that clinked softly, and the wide-brimmed hat he was already removing from his head. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that needed a trim. His eyes, she noticed even through her blurred vision, were a striking shade of blue-green that reminded her of the river in spring. "I apologize for intruding," he said, his voice gentle and concerned. "I was just heading to my horse when I heard you. Are you hurt?" Clara shook her head, mortified that anyone had witnessed her breakdown. She tried to wipe her eyes with her hands, but the tears kept coming. The cowboy stood there for a moment, seeming uncertain, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a neatly folded white handkerchief. "Here," he said, extending it toward her. "Please take it." She hesitated, but another sob racked her body and she accepted the offering, pressing the soft cotton to her face. It smelled clean, like soap and sunshine. For several minutes, he simply stood there quietly, giving her space to compose herself while making it clear through his presence that she wasn't alone. There was something remarkably kind about that gesture, about the way he didn't rush her or ask probing questions. Finally, when her breathing had steadied somewhat, Clara lowered the handkerchief and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm terribly sorry you had to witness such a display." "No need to apologize," he said softly. "We all have moments that test us." "My name is James Thornton, though most folks call me James or Thorn, depending on their mood." He offered her a small, encouraging smile. "I'm a ranch hand over at the Double R spread about 10 miles north of town." "Clara Bennett," she replied automatically, then felt fresh tears prick her eyes at the sound of her own name. Soon, that name would mean nothing here. She'd have no home to attach it to, no family to carry it forward with. James's expression grew more concerned. "Miss Bennett, I don't mean to pry, but is there someone I can fetch for you? Family or friends?" The simple question broke something open inside her. "There's no one," she said, her voice cracking. "My father died 3 weeks ago, I have no other family, and now the bank is taking everything. I have to leave our house by Friday, but I have nowhere to go and no money for passage anywhere even if I did." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them aloud might somehow make the situation less overwhelming. Instead, it just made it more real. James's jaw tightened, and she saw something flash in his eyes that might have been anger, though she didn't think it was directed at her. "Samuel Bennett was your father?" he asked. Clara nodded, surprised. "You knew him?" "I met him a handful of times when he came into town for supplies." He seemed like a decent, hard-working man. I'm very sorry for your loss. James turned his hat over in his hands, clearly thinking. The bank is Dalton's, I presume? Yes. He said my father owed far more than the property was worth. I knew things were difficult, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Papa never wanted to worry me. Clara clutched the handkerchief tighter. I've been trying to think of what to do. I can sew and cook and keep house, but no one in town is hiring. Mrs. Patterson said she already has help at the store, and the hotel has all the staff they need. James was quiet for a long moment, still turning that hat in his hands. The afternoon sun beat down on them, making the air shimmer with heat waves. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression that was both earnest and slightly uncertain. Miss Bennett, what I'm about to suggest may seem forward, but I want you to know I mean it with the utmost respect and with no ill intentions. Clara felt her heart begin to pound, though she wasn't sure if it was from anxiety or something else. The Double R is owned by Richard and Rose Carmichael. They're good people, some of the finest I've ever worked for. Rose has been saying for months that she needs help with the house. Richard has been wanting to hire someone to help with the cooking for the ranch hands during the busy seasons. We've got 20 men working the spread right now, getting ready for the cattle drive to market in the fall. It's honest work, and it comes with room and board. The pay isn't grand, but it would be yours to keep, to save up if you wanted to eventually move on to somewhere else. Hope flickered in Clara's chest, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. You think they would hire me? I could ride back right now and speak to them. I know Rose would be thrilled to have the help. They have a small cabin on the property that's sitting empty. It used to be for the foreman, but after he moved into the main house when he married their daughter, it's just been vacant. I think they'd let you stay there. James stepped a little closer, his expression earnest. I know we've only just met, and you have no reason to trust me beyond this moment, but I give you my word, Miss Bennett, that the Carmichaels are honorable people. You'd be safe there, and you'd be treated with respect. Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the kindness in his eyes and the sincerity in his voice. But she'd also learned in the past 3 weeks how quickly the world could turn cruel and cold. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook or lazy or any number of things. James smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and almost boyish despite the rugged stubble on his jaw. Something tells me none of those things are true. And as for why I'm doing this, well, my mother always taught me that when you see someone in need and you have the means to help, you do it. Simple as that. He placed his hat back on his head. What do you say, Miss Bennett? Will you let me at least ask them? You don't have to commit to anything right now, just let me present the option. What choice did she really have? Clara nodded slowly. Yes, thank you, Mr. Thornton, I would be very grateful. James, he corrected gently. Please, just call me James, Mr. Thornton was my father, and I'm not nearly formal enough to carry that title. He gestured toward the street. Do you have somewhere to wait while I ride out to the ranch? It'll take me about an hour there and back. I can wait at my house. It's the small yellow one at the end of Maple Street. I know the one. I'll come find you as soon as I have an answer. James touched the brim of his hat in a respectful gesture, then turned to leave. After a few steps, he paused and looked back at her. Miss Bennett, things are going to get better. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but they will. Then he was gone, his boots thudding against the packed dirt as he rounded the corner of the building. Clara stood there for a long moment, still holding his handkerchief, feeling as though she'd just experienced something significant, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Finally, she took a shaky breath and started the walk back to the house that would soon no longer be hers. The next hour passed with agonizing slowness. Clara tried to keep busy by continuing the sorting she'd been doing before she'd fled to town in distress. Most of her father's belongings would have to be left behind or sold for whatever pennies they might bring. She carefully folded his best shirt, the one he'd worn to church on Sundays, and set it in the small trunk that held the few things she planned to take with her wherever she ended up. Her mother's wedding ring, which Clara wore on a chain around her neck. The Bible that had her family's names inscribed in the front. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day, faded and precious. A quilt her grandmother had made. It wasn't much to show for 22 years of life, but it was all she had. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats outside, Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She rushed to the window and saw James dismounting from a dappled gray horse. His expression was unreadable as he walked up the short path to her door. Clara opened it before he could knock, searching his face for any clue about what news he brought. "Mrs. Carmichael would like to meet you," James said, and Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. "I explained your situation, and she said to bring you back with me right now if you're willing." "She's already preparing the cabin," he paused. "I borrowed one of the work horses for you to ride. She's gentle and won't give you any trouble." "Now," Clara looked down at her mourning dress, dusty and wrinkled from the day's trials, "I'm not exactly presentable. Rose won't care about that. But if you'd like a few minutes to gather anything you want to bring, I can wait." Clara nodded and hurried back to her small bedroom. She changed quickly into a simpler brown dress that would be more practical for the ride, then tied her light brown hair back with a ribbon. She splashed water on her face from the basin, trying to erase the evidence of her earlier tears. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a young woman with red-rimmed hazel eyes and a pale, anxious face. She pinched her cheeks, trying to bring some color to them, then gave up. She was who she was, and if the Carmichaels didn't want to hire her based on her appearance after a day of grief and stress, then it wasn't meant to be. She carried her trunk outside, and James immediately took it from her hands to secure it to his horse. "It's not heavy," she protested. "Maybe not, but I've got it now," he said with an easy smile. He helped her mount the chestnut mare he'd brought, making sure she was secure in the saddle before swinging up onto his own horse. "It's about a 40-minute ride. The terrain is pretty flat, so it should be comfortable enough." They rode out of Cheyenne at an easy pace, heading north across the rolling grasslands that characterized this part of Wyoming territory. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. Despite the circumstances, Clara found herself relaxing slightly as they rode. There was something soothing about the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her and the vast openness of the landscape around them. "Have you worked for the Carmichaels long?" she asked after they'd been riding for about 10 minutes. "Coming up on 4 years now," James replied. "I started when I was 21, fresh off the trail from Texas where I'd been working cattle since I was 16. The Double R is the best outfit I've ever worked for. Richard knows cattle like most men know their own names, and Rose runs that household with a kindness and efficiency that would put a general to shame. They've got one daughter, Lily, who married the foreman Jack Morrison last year. They live in the main house now, helping run things." "And the other ranch hands, are they decent men?" James glanced over at her and she saw understanding in his eyes. He knew she was asking if she'd be safe. "They're good men, every one of them. Some are a bit rough around the edges, but they're respectful. Richard doesn't tolerate anything less. We had a hand a couple of years back who made an inappropriate comment to a woman in town, and Richard fired him on the spot. Everyone knows the rules, and everyone follows them." Clara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "You said earlier that you have 20 men right now." "That's right. We bring on extra hands during the busy seasons. In the winter, we're down to about a dozen. The ranch runs about 5,000 head of cattle plus horses. It's one of the larger operations in the territory." Pride was evident in James's voice as he spoke. "Richard built it up from nothing over the past 20 years. He and Rose came out here right after the war ended in 1865, when this was even wilder than it is now. They've worked hard for everything they have. It sounds like you admire them greatly." "I do. They gave me a chance when I was just a kid who thought he knew everything about working cattle. Turned out I knew enough to be dangerous and not much else. Richard taught me the right way to do things, and Rose made sure I didn't live on nothing but beans and hardtack." James's smile was warm with genuine affection. "They're like family to me now. My own folks died when I was 15, so I've been on my own for a long time. The double R is the closest thing to a home I've had since then. Clara understood that feeling more than she could express. The loss of a home, of family, of the security that came with belonging somewhere. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I'm sorry about your parents. Thank you. It was a fever that took them both within a week of each other. My older brother too. I was the only one who survived it." James's voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara could hear the old pain underneath. "It's been 10 years now. The grief doesn't go away exactly, but it becomes something you learn to carry." "That's what people keep telling me," Clara said. "Right now it feels like I'm drowning in it." "It will get easier, I promise you that." James pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings was visible in the distance. "That's the double R." As they drew closer, Clara could make out the details of the ranch. The main house was a sprawling two-story structure built from timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Several outbuildings were arranged nearby, including a massive barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various sheds and storage structures. Everything looked well-maintained and prosperous. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. A woman emerged from the main house as they rode into the yard. She was in her early 50s, Clara guessed, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun and a warm, open face. She wore a simple calico dress with an apron tied around her waist, and she smiled as James and Clara dismounted. "You must be Clara," the woman said, coming forward with her hand extended. "I'm Rose Carmichael. James told me about your situation, and I'm so very sorry about your father." Clara shook her hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in the woman's grip and tone. "Thank you, Mrs. Carmichael. I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice." "Nonsense. It's perfect timing. I've been at my wits' end trying to manage the house and help with the ranch work and keep all these hungry men fed. Richard keeps telling me to hire someone, but I've been putting it off because finding the right person is so difficult." Rose looked Clara over with an assessing but kind eye. "James says you can cook and sew and keep house." "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me before she passed when I was 14. I've been keeping house for my father ever since." "Good, good. Let me show you the cabin where you'd be staying, and then we can discuss the details of what the work would entail and what we can offer you in return." Rose linked her arm through Clara's in a friendly, informal gesture that immediately put Clara more at ease. As they walked across the yard toward a small cabin set apart from the other buildings, Rose called back to James. "Would you let Richard know our guest is here?" "He's in the barn checking on that mare." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, tipping his hat before heading off toward the barn with both horses in tow. The cabin was small but charming, with a covered porch and window boxes that had clearly once held flowers, though they were empty now. Inside, it was a single large room with a stone fireplace on one end, a bed frame in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a basic kitchen area with a stove and shelves. It was dusty from disuse, but Clara could see the potential in it. With some cleaning and a few personal touches, it could be quite cozy. "I know it's not much," Rose said, "but it's sturdy and warm. We can provide bedding and basic supplies. You'd take your meals with the family in the main house unless you preferred to cook for yourself here, which you're welcome to do. We'd supply the food either way." "It's wonderful," Clara said honestly. "Much more than I expected," Rose smiled. "Good, now, as for the work, I'll be plain with you. It's a lot. The main house has 6 bedrooms, a kitchen, a dining room, and a parlor. With my daughter and son-in-law living with us now, plus Richard and myself, that's 4 people making daily mess and needing meals. Then there's the ranch hands. I usually cook a big noon meal for them, and they're responsible for their own breakfast and supper in the bunkhouse, though I often send things over. During busy times like now, with all the extra hands, it can be overwhelming. I can handle hard work," Clara assured her. "I'm not afraid of it." "I can see that in you. You've got the look of someone who's been through trials and come out standing." Rose walked over to the window and looked out at the ranch yard. I'll be honest, Clara. Part of the reason I wanted to meet you right away is because I believe in trusting my instincts about people. James is one of the best judges of character I know. If he thought well enough of you to bring you here, that speaks volumes to me. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at those words. He was very kind to me today. I was in quite a state when he found me. James has a good heart. He's steady and reliable, and he cares about people. Those qualities are rarer than they should be. Rose turned back to Clara. I'm prepared to offer you $12 a month plus room and board. That includes this cabin, all your meals, and any supplies you need for personal use within reason. I'll expect you to help with cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, and general household management. You'd have Sundays off except for basic meal preparation, and we close down work early on Saturdays. Does that sound acceptable to you? $12 a month was more than Clara had expected. It would take her time to save enough to really give her options, but it was a start. More importantly, it was security and a place to belong, at least for now. Yes, Mrs. Carmichael, that sounds very acceptable. When would you like me to start? Could you start tomorrow? I know that's asking a lot, but I'm desperate for the help, and James mentioned you need to be out of your house by Friday anyway. We can send some of the hands into town with a wagon to collect your belongings. Tomorrow would be fine, Clara said, feeling almost dizzy with relief. Less than 2 hours ago, she'd been sobbing behind the general store with no prospects and no hope. Now she had a job, a home, and a chance to rebuild her life. Rose clasped Clara's hands warmly. Wonderful. Let me introduce you to my husband, and then we'll get you settled in for tonight. Tomorrow we can start fresh. Richard Carmichael turned out to be a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with weathered skin and kind gray eyes. He shook Clara's hand with a grip that was firm but not crushing and welcomed her to the Double R with genuine warmth. Their daughter Lily was a pretty young woman of about 20 with her mother's blonde hair and her father's gray eyes. She was friendly and enthusiastic about having another woman around the ranch. That evening, Clara took supper with the family in the main house. The dining room was comfortable and well-appointed, with a long table that could easily seat a dozen people. The meal was simple but delicious: roast beef and potatoes with fresh bread and greens from Rose's garden. The conversation flowed easily, with Richard and Jack discussing plans for the upcoming cattle drive, and Rose asking Clara about her preferences for how to organize the housework. James joined them for dinner, along with Jack, as apparently the foreman and James often took meals with the family. Clara found herself seated across from James, and several times during the meal she caught him watching her with an expression that seemed both protective and curious. When their eyes met, he'd smile, and she'd feel that strange flutter in her chest again. After dinner, James walked her back to the cabin carrying a load of bedding Rose had pressed into his arms. The sun had set, and the sky was awash in deep purples and blues, with the first stars beginning to appear. The air had cooled significantly, and Clara wrapped her arms around herself as they walked. "It gets cold at night, even in summer," James commented. "Comes from being up in the high plains. You'll want to keep a fire going in the evenings once fall comes." "I'll remember that," Clara said. They reached the cabin, and James carried the bedding inside, setting it on the bed frame. "I brought your trunk in earlier," he said, gesturing to where it sat near the foot of the bed. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all. Thank you for everything you've done today, James." "I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." James turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. I'm just glad things worked out. You deserve a chance to get back on your feet." He moved toward the door, then paused. "If you need anything, the bunkhouse is just over there. I'm usually the last one awake, so if there's any trouble or you need help with anything, don't hesitate to come find me." "I'm sure I'll be fine, but thank you." He nodded and touched his hat brim in that gesture she was coming to recognize. "Good night, Clara. Welcome to the Double R." "Good night, James." After he left, Clara stood in the middle of the small cabin for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened since this morning. She'd woken up in despair, certain her life was over. Now she was standing in a cabin on a ranch 40 minutes outside of Cheyenne, employed by people who seemed genuinely kind, with a future that held at least the possibility of stability. And then there was James. She barely knew him, had met him only hours ago under the worst possible circumstances. Yet there was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since her father fell ill. The way he'd offered his handkerchief without making her feel weak for crying. The way he'd taken action to help her without asking for anything in return. The gentle respect in how he spoke to her and looked at her. Clara shook her head, smiling at herself. She was being foolish, reading too much into simple kindness. James had probably helped her the same way he'd help anyone in trouble. There was nothing special about it, nothing personal. She needed to focus on making a good impression with the Carmichaels and proving she could handle the work they were hiring her for. Romance was the last thing she needed to be thinking about right now. Still, as she made up the bed with the linens Rose had provided and changed into her nightgown, Clara found her thoughts drifting back to a pair of blue-green eyes and a kind smile. She fell asleep with James's handkerchief, which she'd forgotten to return, folded carefully on the small table beside her bed. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and men's voices calling to each other as the ranch came to life. She dressed quickly in her brown work dress, braided her hair and wound it into a bun at the nape of her neck and headed to the main house. Rose was already in the kitchen, working on breakfast. "Good morning," Rose said cheerfully. "I thought we'd start you off easy today." "How are you with making biscuits?" Clara smiled. "My biscuits were one of the few things my father regularly complimented. Perfect. The men love their biscuits with breakfast. We'll make several dozen. They'll go through them like locusts through wheat." Working alongside Rose, Clara fell into an easy rhythm. The kitchen was well organized and well stocked, much better than what she'd had to work with at home. They prepared biscuits, fried eggs, bacon, and a large pot of oatmeal. By the time the sun was fully up, the table was laden with food. The ranch hands ate in shifts, some coming in while others were already out working. Clara stayed in the kitchen, helping Rose keep the food coming and cleaning up as they went. She caught glimpses of James among the men, but he was busy and didn't come into the house. After breakfast was cleared and the kitchen cleaned, Rose showed Clara around the rest of the house. The bedrooms on the second floor needed fresh linens and dusting. The parlor needed a thorough cleaning. There was mending piled in a basket that looked like it had been accumulating for weeks. The work was indeed substantial, but Clara had expected that. She rolled up her sleeves and got to it. The days developed a rhythm. Clara would rise early, help Rose prepare breakfast, then spend the morning on housework while Rose managed the garden and other outdoor tasks. Midday dinner was the biggest meal, and they'd spend hours in the kitchen preparing enough food to feed the hungry ranch hands. Afternoons were for more housework, mending, or helping Rose with whatever needed doing. Supper for the family was simpler, and then Clara would return to her cabin as darkness fell. She saw James regularly, but usually only in passing or at family dinners. He worked long days, often leaving before sunrise and returning after sunset. When they did interact, he was friendly and courteous, always asking how she was settling in and if she needed anything. Clara found herself looking forward to those brief conversations, to the way his face would light up when he smiled, to the way he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. 2 weeks after Clara arrived at the Double R, Rose sent her into town with a list of supplies they needed from the general store. Jack hitched up the wagon and helped Clara onto the bench seat, then handed her the reins. "You comfortable driving?" he asked. "I've driven a wagon before," Clara assured him. "I'll be fine." "Good, take your time and be careful, the road can be rough in places." The ride into Cheyenne gave Clara time to think. She hadn't been back to town since the day James had found her crying. The thought of seeing the house that had been her home, now surely occupied by someone else or sitting empty, made her chest ache. But she was also grateful for how much had changed. She had purpose now and security. She was earning her own money and building toward a future, even if that future was still uncertain. At Patterson's general store, Clara worked through Rose's list efficiently. Mrs. Patterson was friendly but clearly curious, asking several pointed questions about Clara's new employment at the Double R. Clara answered politely, but didn't volunteer more information than necessary. She knew how small towns worked. Anything she said would be all over Cheyenne by tomorrow. As she was loading the supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice made her freeze. Well, Miss Bennett, I heard you'd found employment as a servant at the Carmichael ranch." Clara turned to find Mr. Dalton, the banker, standing a few feet away. His expression held a smugness that made her want to slap him, though she kept her face carefully neutral. "I'm employed as a housekeeper, Mr. Dalton. There's no shame in honest work." "Of course not." "I'm just surprised you found anyone willing to take you on with no references and no real skills to speak of." Dalton's smile was thin and cold. "Your father was never very good at making sound decisions. I suppose you take after him in that regard." Anger flared hot in Clara's chest. "My father was a good man who worked himself to exhaustion trying to build something in this territory. If the banks weren't so quick to bleed people dry with interest and fees, he might have succeeded." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Miss Bennett. That sounds dangerously close to slander. Your father borrowed money he couldn't pay back. That's not the bank's fault." "Borrowed money at rates that made it nearly impossible to repay," Clara shot back. "Everyone knows your practices, Mr. Dalton. Just because they're legal doesn't make them right." "I don't have to stand here and be insulted by some servant girl," Dalton said coldly. He turned and walked away, his back rigid with indignation. Clara's hands were shaking as she climbed onto the wagon bench. She sat there for a moment, taking deep breaths and trying to calm herself. She shouldn't have let Dalton get to her, shouldn't have said those things. But the casual cruelty in how he'd spoken about her father had been too much to bear. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than the ride into town. Clara's mind kept replaying the encounter, thinking of things she should have said or shouldn't have said. By the time she pulled into the ranch yard, she'd worked herself into a state of anxious distress. James was near the barn when she drove in. He looked up, smiled, and started to wave, but his smile faded when he got a better look at her face. He strode over quickly as she was climbing down from the wagon. "Clara, what happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, but her voice wavered. "I just had an unpleasant encounter in town." James's expression darkened. "Did someone hurt you?" "No, nothing like that. It was just Mr. Dalton from the bank. He said some unkind things about my father, and I'm afraid I lost my temper." Clara pressed her hands to her face. "I shouldn't have engaged with him. I should have just walked away." "Dalton is a miserable excuse for a human being," James said flatly. "Whatever you said to him, he probably deserved it." He started unloading the supplies from the wagon, his movements sharp with barely contained anger. "What did he say?" Clara helped him with the lighter items, grateful to have something to do with her hands. "It doesn't matter, just the usual implications that my father was foolish and I'm of no consequence." She tried to smile. "I'm being overly sensitive. I should let it go." James stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. "Clara, you have every right to be upset. Dalton makes his money by taking advantage of people when they're at their lowest. Your father wasn't foolish. He was brave for trying to build something out here, and he was unlucky that circumstances didn't work in his favor. There's no shame in that." The fierce conviction in James's voice, the way he defended her father without hesitation, made Clara's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. They finished unloading the wagon in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. When the last of the supplies had been carried into the house, James touched Clara's arm gently. "Try not to let Dalton's words poison your day. He's not worth it." "I'll try." Clara managed a more genuine smile this time. "Thank you, James. You always seem to know the right thing to say." He ducked his head, looking almost bashful. "I just say what's true." Then he cleared his throat and gestured toward the corrals. "I should get back to work. But if you need anything, you know where to find me." "I do." Clara watched him walk away, noting the easy confidence in his stride, the way his shoulders filled out his work shirt. She was developing feelings for him, she realized with a start. Real feelings that went beyond gratitude and friendly affection. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She barely knew him, had known him for only 2 weeks. And yet, she found herself thinking about him constantly, looking for him during the day, treasuring every smile and conversation. This was dangerous. She was here to work, to rebuild her life. Getting emotionally entangled with a cowboy, no matter how kind he seemed, was a complication she couldn't afford. James had never indicated he felt anything for her beyond friendly concern. For all she knew, he was simply a good person who would have done the same for anyone. She needed to guard her heart and focus on her responsibilities. But as the days passed, guarding her heart became increasingly difficult. James had a way of seeking her out during quiet moments. He'd appear in the kitchen with fresh vegetables from the garden, claiming Rose had asked him to deliver them, though Clara suspected he was making excuses. He'd offer to help her carry heavy baskets of laundry or to reach items on high shelves. He'd linger at family dinners, engaging her in conversation about books they'd both read or places they'd both been or dreams they both held. One evening about a month after Clara had arrived at the Double R, she was sitting on the porch of her cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. She'd been mending one of Richard's work shirts, but had set it aside to simply enjoy the beauty of the evening. The sound of footsteps made her look up to find James approaching, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Evening," he said with that smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "I brought you something." "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, but she was already curious about what he was carrying. James sat down on the porch steps, leaving a respectful distance between them, and handed her the wrapped item. "Open it." Clara carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal a leather-bound journal and a pencil. The journal was beautiful, with intricate tooling on the cover in a floral pattern. She looked up at James in surprise. "This is too much." "It's not. I noticed you like to write. I've seen you making notes on scraps of paper in the kitchen. I thought you might like something more permanent to write in." James looked almost nervous. "If you don't like it, I can—" "I love it," Clara interrupted, running her fingers over the detailed leatherwork. "It's beautiful, James." "Thank you." She met his eyes, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "This is one of the kindest gifts anyone has ever given me." His smile broadened and some of the tension left his shoulders. "I'm glad. I was worried it might seem presumptuous." "Not at all. I do love to write. I used to keep a diary when I was younger, but I had to leave it behind when I left my father's house. There wasn't room in the trunk." Clara opened the journal, breathing in the scent of new leather and fresh paper. "I don't even know what to write first." "Write about anything you want. Your thoughts, your day, stories you make up. It's yours to fill however you choose." James stretched his legs out, leaning back on his hands and looking out at the sunset. "I'm not much of a writer myself, but I've always admired people who are. It seems like a way of making sense of the world, putting thoughts into words." "That's exactly what it is," Clara agreed. "My mother used to write poetry, nothing that was ever published, just little verses she'd jot down and leave around the house. I used to find them tucked into books or under my pillow. After she died, I collected them all and put them in a box. I still have them." "That's a beautiful way to remember her." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Clara found herself very aware of James's presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the way his profile looked gilded in the golden light. She wanted to move closer, to close the distance between them, but she held herself still. "Clara," James said after a while, his voice quieter and more serious than usual. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you plan to stay here? At the Double R, I mean, or is this just temporary until you save enough to move on somewhere else? Clara considered the question carefully. I don't know, she admitted. When I first came here, I thought of it as temporary, a way to get back on my feet before figuring out what comes next. But the longer I'm here, the more it feels like somewhere I could stay. Rose and Richard have been wonderful to me. Lily is becoming a good friend. The work is hard but satisfying. I'm happy here in a way I didn't expect to be. She paused, then added softly, and there are other reasons I find myself wanting to stay. She didn't elaborate on what those other reasons were, but when she glanced at James, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken but powerful. I'm glad, James said finally. Glad that you're happy here. Glad that you want to stay. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. The ranch feels different with you here. Better. Different how? Clara asked, her heart pounding. James turned to face her more fully, and the vulnerability in his expression was striking. You bring a lightness to things, a warmth. When I come in from a long day and hear you laughing with Rose in the kitchen, or when I see you reading on this porch in the evenings, or when you smile at me across the dinner table, it makes everything feel more like home than it ever has before. He ran a hand through his hair, looking almost frustrated. I'm not saying this right. What I mean is that I find myself looking for you during the day, finding excuses to talk to you, thinking about you when I should be focused on work. And I can't tell if I'm reading too much into our conversations, if I'm seeing things that aren't there because I want them to be there. Clara's breath had gone shallow. You're not reading too much into them, she whispered. Hope flared in James's eyes. I'm not. No. Clara set the journal carefully aside and shifted closer to him, her heart feeling like it might beat right out of her chest. I think about you constantly, James. I look for you too. Every conversation we have, no matter how brief, is the best part of my day. When you brought me here that first day, you saved my life in more ways than one. And somewhere in the past 6 weeks, I started falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, brave and terrifying. For a moment, James simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out and cupped her face with his hand, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. Clara, he breathed. I've been falling for you since the moment I found you behind that store and you looked up at me with those hazel eyes full of tears and fire. I've never felt anything like this before. I've never wanted to be around someone the way I want to be around you. I've never imagined a future with someone the way I imagine one with you. What kind of future do you imagine? Clara asked, leaning into his touch. One where I get to see you every day. Where I get to make you smile and laugh. Where maybe someday, if you'd have me, you'd agree to be my wife and we could build a life together. James's voice was rough with emotion. I know it's too soon to talk about things like that. I know we've only known each other a short time. But Clara, I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about how I feel about you. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but they were tears of joy. It's not too soon, she said. When something is right, you just know, and this feels right, James, you feel right. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Clara didn't want to pull away. She wanted him with an intensity that surprised her. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and perfect. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it held a promise of everything to come. When they broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do this right. I want everyone to know that you're spoken for, that my intentions are honorable. I'd like that, Clara said, smiling through her tears. Though I think Rose might have already guessed. She's made several comments about how much time we spend talking. James laughed. Rose doesn't miss much. I wouldn't be surprised if she and Richard have been plotting this since the day I brought you here. They sat together on the porch as the stars came out, talking quietly about everything and nothing. James held Clara's hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her skin. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, sitting there with him, feeling safe and cherished and seen in a way she'd never experienced before. The next morning, James formally asked Richard for permission to court Clara. Richard, predictably, gave his blessing with a knowing smile and a comment about how it was about time James made his intentions clear. Rose hugged Clara and said she'd been hoping for exactly this development. Lily squealed with delight and immediately started planning what she called courting activities, though Clara wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Over the following weeks, James courted Clara with a combination of traditional gestures and personal touches that showed how well he was coming to know her. He brought her wildflowers he'd picked while out checking fences. He took her on evening rides across the ranch, showing her his favorite spots and sharing stories from his years working the land. He sat with her on her cabin porch in the evenings, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence while she wrote in her journal, and he whittled small figures from scraps of wood. He also made sure to respect her reputation and her comfort. They were never alone together in a way that could be considered inappropriate. He always asked permission before kissing her, though she always said yes, and those kisses remained sweet and respectful even as the passion between them grew. He told her repeatedly that he would wait for her, that there was no rush, that he wanted her to be certain about her feelings before they took any further steps. But Clara was certain, more certain than she'd ever been about anything. James was everything she'd never known she needed. He was steady and strong, but also gentle and thoughtful. He made her laugh with his dry observations about ranch life. He listened when she talked about her dreams and fears. He supported her when she had difficult days, and he celebrated with her when she had victories, no matter how small. 3 months after Clara had arrived at the Double R, she was working in the kitchen one afternoon when Rose came in looking flushed and excited. "Clara, dear, would you mind taking some lunch out to the men? They're working on repairs to the north fence line, and I promised I'd send something substantial." "Of course," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is James with them?" "He is," Rose said with a knowing smile. "In fact, he specifically asked if you might be the one to bring the food." Clara felt her cheeks warm but couldn't help smiling. She packed a basket with sandwiches, cold chicken, fresh bread, and a jug of water, then borrowed one of the gentler horses and rode out to where the men were working. The fence line was about 2 miles from the main ranch buildings, in an area where the grass grew tall and golden and a line of cottonwood trees provided shade. She found the work crew easily enough. About 8 men were stretched along the fence line, replacing broken posts and restringing wire. James saw her coming and immediately set down his tools, jogging over to help her dismount and take the heavy basket. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he said, smiling at her in that way that never failed to make her heart race. "We were just saying how hungry we were. Then my timing is perfect." Clara watched as James called the other men over, and they descended on the food like a swarm of locusts, just as Rose had predicted weeks ago. Within minutes, the basket was nearly empty. James had set aside 2 sandwiches and some chicken before the others could claim everything. He took Clara's hand and led her over to the shade of the cottonwood trees, spreading his jacket on the ground for her to sit on. "I should get back," Clara said, though she made no move to leave. "Rose will need help with supper preparations." "Rose specifically told me to keep you here for at least an hour," James said, settling down beside her. "She said you've been working too hard and need a break." "I've been working no harder than anyone else. You've been working harder than most." James bit into his sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Clara, I've been thinking about something. That sounds serious." "It is a bit." He set the sandwich aside and turned to face her more fully. "The cattle drive is coming up in about 6 weeks. We'll be taking the herd to market in Denver. It's a 3-week trip there and back, maybe longer depending on conditions." Clara's stomach sank. 3 weeks without seeing James sounded unbearable. "I see." "I don't want to be away from you for that long," James continued. "But it's part of the job and it's important. Richard depends on me and I can't let him down." He reached out and took her hand. "But before I go, I want to make sure you know how serious I am about us, about our future." "I know you're serious, James. I've never doubted that." "I want to marry you, Clara." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know we've only been courting for 3 months, and I know some people might say that's not long enough to make such a decision. But I don't need more time to know that you're the woman I want to spend my life with. I love you. I love everything about you, and if you'll have me, I'd like to ask you to be my wife." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes for what felt like the 100th time since she'd met this man. But these were happy tears, tears of joy and certainty. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, James, I'll marry you. I love you too, more than I knew it was possible to love someone." James let out a breath that sounded like relief and wonder combined. He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small but beautiful sapphire. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "It's the only thing I have from her. I know it's not fancy, but it's perfect," Clara interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "It's absolutely perfect." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that had been carefully restrained until this moment. Clara kissed him back just as fervently, wrapping her arms around his neck and pouring everything she felt into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I want to get married before I leave for the cattle drive," he said. "I know that doesn't give us much time to plan anything elaborate, but I don't need elaborate, I just need you." "I don't need elaborate either," Clara agreed. "Just us and the people we care about and a preacher, that's all I need." They rode back to the ranch together, Clara on her borrowed horse and James beside her on his gelding. When they arrived, Rose took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy that brought Richard running from the barn. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Rose insisted on opening a bottle of wine Richard had been saving for a special occasion. Lily cried happy tears and hugged Clara so tightly she could barely breathe. Richard shook James's hand and clapped him on the shoulder with genuine affection. That evening, as the household gathered around the dinner table, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To James and Clara, may your love grow stronger with each passing year, and may your life together be filled with joy and prosperity." "To James and Clara," everyone echoed, and Clara felt so full of happiness she thought she might burst. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Rose and Lily threw themselves into helping Clara prepare for the wedding, despite her insistence that she didn't need anything fancy. A dress was made, simple but beautiful, in a soft cream color with lace at the collar and cuffs. Arrangements were made with the preacher in town. Rose planned a meal for after the ceremony. Lily decorated the parlor with wildflowers and ribbons. Through it all, Clara and James stole moments together whenever they could. They walked together in the evenings, talking about their plans for the future. James had been saving money for years, and combined with what Clara had started to put away, they had enough to think about eventually buying a small piece of land of their own. But for now, they'd stay at the Double R. Richard had already offered to build them a small house on the ranch property, and James would continue working as one of his top hands. "Someday, I want to have cattle of our own," James told her one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "Not a huge operation like Richard's, but enough to support a family. I want to build something that will last, something we can pass on to our children." "Our children," Clara repeated softly, loving the sound of those words. "How many children do you imagine us having?" "As many as you're willing to give me," James said with a grin. "Though I'll admit, I've always imagined at least 2 or 3. I hated being alone after my family died. I want our home to be full of life and noise and love." "I want that too," Clara said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling utterly content. "I want everything with you, James." The wedding took place on a bright September morning, exactly 5 months after James had first found Clara crying behind the general store. The ceremony was held in the small church in Cheyenne, with the preacher officiating and about 30 guests in attendance. Rose and Richard were there, of course, along with Lily and Jack and many of the ranch hands, even Mrs. Patterson from the general store came, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the ceremony. Clara wore her cream dress with her hair arranged in a simple style, pinned up with small white flowers. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Lily had gathered that morning. As she walked down the aisle on Richard's arm, having asked him to give her away since she had no family of her own, she had eyes only for James. He stood at the front of the church in his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue-green eyes bright with emotion. When Clara reached him, he took her hand and held it tightly, as if he'd never let her go. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage and the responsibilities that came with it. But Clara barely heard the words. She was too focused on James, on the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When it came time for vows, James's voice was steady and strong. "I, James Thornton, take you, Clara Bennett, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to stand by you in times of joy and in times of sorrow. I promise to build a life with you that is founded on respect, trust, and unwavering love. This I vow before God and these witnesses." Clara's own vows were delivered through tears of happiness. "I, Clara Bennett, take you, James Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with everything I am. I promise to support you in all you do, to build a home with you filled with warmth and laughter, and to face whatever challenges come our way with courage and faith. You saved me when I had nothing, and now I give you everything I am and everything I will be. This I vow before God and these witnesses." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told James he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was both tender and passionate, a promise of everything to come. The small church erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration that followed at the ranch was joyful and spirited. Rose had outdone herself with the food, laying out a feast that included roasted chicken, beef, fresh bread, several kinds of vegetables from her garden, and 3 different pies. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing. James twirled Clara around the parlor until they were both breathless and laughing. As the sun began to set, James and Clara slipped away from the party. They walked hand in hand to the small house that had been prepared for them. It wasn't large, just 3 rooms, but it was sturdy and well-built, and it was theirs. Rose had helped Clara furnish it with the basics, and Lily had left wildflowers in vases throughout. James carried Clara over the threshold, making her laugh with delight. He set her down gently in the middle of the main room, then cupped her face in his hands. "Hello, Mrs. Thornton," he said softly. "Hello, Mr. Thornton," she replied, loving the sound of her new name. Their wedding night was everything Clara had hoped it would be, full of tenderness and passion and love. James was gentle and patient, making sure she felt comfortable and cherished. When they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as the moon rose outside their window, Clara felt a peace she'd never known before. She was home. Not in a place, but with a person. James was her home and she was his. The next few days passed in a blissful haze. James delayed his departure for the cattle drive by a week, wanting to spend as much time with his new bride as possible. They took long rides across the ranch, picnicked by a small creek that ran through the property, and spent hours just talking and being together. At night, they explored their new marriage with a growing passion and intimacy that left them both feeling closer than ever. But all too soon, the day came for James to leave. The cattle drive couldn't be delayed any longer. The herd needed to reach Denver before the weather turned, and every day mattered. Clara helped James pack his saddlebags, trying hard not to cry. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for it, but the reality of being separated from him for nearly a month was harder than she'd anticipated. "I'll write you letters," James promised, holding her close. "Every chance I get, I'll write to you, and I'll be back before you know it." "Be safe," Clara whispered against his chest. "Please, James, be careful out there." "I will, I promise." He tilted her chin up and kissed her deeply. "I love you, Clara, more than anything in this world. I love you too." She stood in the yard with Rose and Lily, watching as James and the other men drove the herd north toward Denver. James looked back several times, raising his hand in a wave until he was too far away to see clearly. When the dust cloud from the cattle finally disappeared over the horizon, Clara allowed herself to cry. Rose put an arm around her shoulders. "He'll be back, dear, and the time will pass more quickly than you think." Rose was right, though the first week dragged painfully. Clara threw herself into work, helping Rose with the increased household tasks now that several of the men were gone. She cleaned and cooked and mended and tried not to count the hours until James would return. But then, at the end of the first week, a rider came to the ranch carrying mail. Among the letters was one for Clara, in James's handwriting. She took it to the small house she now thought of as home and read it eagerly. "My dearest Clara," James had written in his neat, careful script. "We've been on the trail for 6 days now, and I miss you more with each passing hour. The work is hard and the days are long, but every night when I lie down under the stars, I think of you and it makes everything bearable. I carry your memory with me like a talisman. I see your smile in the sunrise, hear your laugh in the wind, feel your love in the warmth of the sun. Richard says I'm hopeless, that I've got the look of a man completely besotted, and he's right. I am completely, utterly, hopelessly in love with you. Only 2 more weeks until I see you again. I'm counting the days, the hours, the minutes. Stay safe, my love. All my heart, James." Clara read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in a box where she planned to keep all his letters. Over the following weeks, 3 more letters arrived, each one making her heart sore. James wrote about the journey, about the challenges they faced with weather and terrain, about the other men and their stories. But mostly he wrote about how much he loved her and missed her and looked forward to being home. Clara wrote back, though she knew her letters might not reach him before he started the journey home. She told him about life on the ranch, about how Rose had taught her to make a new kind of pie, about how she'd helped Lily plant a new section of the garden, about how she fell asleep each night hugging his pillow because it still smelled like him. 26 days after James had left, Clara was in the kitchen helping Rose prepare lunch when Lily burst through the door, breathless and grinning. "They're back. I just saw the dust cloud coming up the road. The cattle drive is back." Clara didn't remember dropping the spoon she'd been holding or running out the door. She didn't remember crossing the yard or how her legs carried her so quickly. All she knew was that suddenly James was there, dismounting from his horse and sweeping her up into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. "You're home," she said over and over, kissing his dusty face, not caring that he probably hadn't bathed in days or that she was getting dirt all over her dress. "You're home, you're home." "I'm home," he agreed, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "God, Clara, I missed you so much." They stood there in the middle of the ranch yard, holding each other while the other men rode past with knowing smiles and good-natured comments. Finally, Richard called out that the men would handle the stock and James should take his wife home. James needed no further encouragement. Still holding Clara's hand, he led her to the small house, shut the door behind them, and proceeded to show her in great detail just how much he'd missed her. It was late afternoon before they emerged again, both disheveled and grinning, to join the others for supper. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The seasons changed, summer giving way to fall and then to winter. Clara and James grew into their marriage, learning each other's rhythms and habits, navigating the small disagreements that came with combining 2 lives, and always coming back to the foundation of love and respect they'd built. In early spring, Clara realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She'd always wanted children, but the reality of bringing a new life into the world was daunting. When she told James, he picked her up and spun her around just like he had the day he'd returned from the cattle drive, then immediately set her down and apologized for being too rough. "I'm not made of glass," Clara laughed. "I'm just pregnant." "You're carrying our child," James said in wonder, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Clara, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the answer clear. "I'm happier than I have any right to be. I'm the luckiest man alive." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you so much. You and this baby, you're my whole world." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Clara continued working for as long as Rose would let her, though eventually Rose insisted she take it easier. James became almost comically protective, worrying about every little thing. He built a cradle from wood he'd carefully selected and sanded until it was smooth as silk. Rose and Lily prepared baby clothes, tiny garments that seemed impossibly small. On a hot August afternoon in 1879, exactly 13 months after James and Clara had married, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, with Rose and the doctor from town helping Clara through it while James paced anxiously outside. When the baby's first cry rang out, James burst through the door, ignoring the doctor's protests. Clara, exhausted but radiant, held their son against her chest. James knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his family. "He's perfect," James whispered. "Clara, he's absolutely perfect." "We have a son," Clara said wonderingly, stroking the baby's dark hair. "What should we name him?" They discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never settled on one definitively. Now, looking at his child's face, James said, Samuel James Thornton, after your father, if that's all right with you." More tears flowed down Clara's cheeks. "Samuel, yes, Papa would have loved that." Little Samuel was a healthy, hungry baby who quickly became the center of everyone's world. Richard and Rose doted on him as if he were their own grandchild. Lily was a devoted aunt, constantly offering to watch him so Clara could rest. The ranch hands would stop by just to get a glimpse of the baby, these rough men turning soft and gentle around the tiny life. But no one loved Samuel more than his parents. James would sit for hours just watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny perfection of his fingers and toes. Clara would sing to Samuel the songs her own mother had sung to her, continuing the legacy of love through generations. Despite the sleepless nights and the exhaustion that came with caring for an infant, both James and Clara felt their love deepen even further. As Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler, he proved to be an adventurous, curious child with his father's blue-green eyes and his mother's hazel flecks mixed in. He learned to walk early, much to James's pride and Clara's concern, and was constantly getting into everything. The little house that had seemed perfectly sized for 2 adults felt much smaller with an energetic toddler exploring every corner. When Samuel was 2 years old, James came to Clara with a proposal. "I've been talking to Richard," he said. "He's willing to sell me 200 acres on the western edge of the ranch. It's good grazing land with access to water. I have enough saved now to make a down payment and buy a small starter herd. We could build our own ranch, Clara. It would be small at first, but it would be ours." Clara looked around the little house they'd made their home, thinking of all the memories they'd created here. Then she thought of the future, of giving Samuel siblings and building something lasting. "Let's do it," she said. Over the next year, James worked harder than Clara had ever seen him work. He continued his duties for Richard while also starting to build their future. He purchased 50 head of cattle with his savings, good breeding stock that would form the foundation of their herd. He and several of the other ranch hands spent their free time building a house on the land James had bought. It wasn't large, but it had 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a parlor with a stone fireplace. By the time Samuel turned 3, the Thornton family moved into their new home. Clara was pregnant again, and James was officially running his own small cattle operation while still helping Richard during busy times. It was exhausting, juggling everything, but it was also deeply satisfying. They were building something real, something that would last. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, a tiny thing with her mother's hazel eyes and a surprisingly loud cry. They named her Rose after the woman who had been such a blessing in their lives. Little Rose was calmer than Samuel had been as a baby, content to be held and sung to for hours. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help take care of her. Clara would find him bringing Rose his favorite toys or trying to sing to her in his off-key toddler voice. James would sit with both children, Samuel on one knee and Rose cradled in his arm, reading to them from the Bible or telling them stories about his adventures as a young cowboy. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing of their family. When Rose was 2, Clara found herself pregnant again. This third child, another boy they named Thomas, completed their family. Thomas was the perfect blend of his siblings, adventurous like Samuel but with Rose's calm temperament. As their children grew, so did their ranch. James proved to have his mentor Richard's skill with cattle, and their herd increased steadily. They hired their first ranch hand when Samuel was 8, a young man not unlike James had been when he'd first come to the Double R. James treated him with the same respect and kindness that Richard had shown him, paying it forward. Clara divided her time between raising their children and helping manage the household and business aspects of the ranch. She kept meticulous books, tracking expenses and income, and proved to have a keen head for business. Together, she and James made decisions about the ranch, true partners in every sense of the word. Samuel grew into a tall, strong boy who followed his father everywhere, learning everything he could about ranching. Rose was gentle and artistic, always drawing or making up stories. Thomas was the wild card, equally comfortable helping his father with the cattle or sitting with his mother while she taught him to read. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Clara on a ride to the spot where he'd first taken her that day after she'd brought lunch to the fence crew, the place where he'd asked her to marry him. The cottonwood trees had grown taller, their shade deeper. James spread a blanket and they sat together, just the two of them, something that was increasingly rare with 3 children. "Do you ever think about that day behind the general store?" James asked, holding Clara's hand. "The day we met, all the time," Clara admitted. "It was the worst day of my life and the best day, all at once. I think about it too, about how close I came to not walking behind that building, to not hearing you cry, how different everything would be if I'd gone a different direction." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Clara. I believe God put me in that exact place at that exact time because He knew we needed each other. I believe that too." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the same peace she'd felt that first night as his wife. "You gave me back my life, James. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love and family and a future I never dreamed possible." "You gave me all those things too," James said softly. "Before you, I was just drifting, working but not really living. You made me want to build something, to create a legacy. Everything good in my life comes from you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds drift across the sky. Finally, Clara said, "We should head back. Rose and Lily are watching the children, but you know how Thomas can be." James laughed. "That boy is going to give us gray hair before we're 40. He stood and helped Clara to her feet, then pulled her close for a long, sweet kiss. "I love you, Mrs. Thornton, today, tomorrow, and forever." "I love you too, Mr. Thornton. Always." As they rode back toward the ranch, Clara reflected on how far they'd come from that desperate day in Cheyenne. She'd been broken and lost, convinced her life was over. Instead, it had been a beginning. James had offered her his handkerchief and his name, and in doing so, he'd given her everything. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were harsh winters when they worried about the cattle. There were dry summers when the grass grew thin and they had to supplement feed. There were times when money was tight and they had to make hard decisions. But through it all, James and Clara faced everything together, their love the foundation that held them steady. Samuel grew into a fine young man who chose to stay on the ranch, working alongside his father. At 20, he married a local girl named Emma, and they built a house on the far edge of the Thornton property. When their first child was born, James and Clara became grandparents, a role they embraced with joy. Rose, their artistic daughter, surprised everyone by falling in love with a teacher who came to the area to start a school. She married at 22 and moved to town, where she helped her husband educate the children of the growing community. She visited often, always bringing drawings and paintings she'd created, which Clara proudly displayed throughout the house. Thomas, their youngest, had his father's wanderlust. At 18, he announced he wanted to see more of the world before settling down. James and Clara let him go with their blessing and their prayers, knowing he needed to find his own path. He traveled for 3 years, working various jobs throughout the West, before finally returning home with stories to tell and a new appreciation for the ranch he'd grown up on. Through all these changes, James and Clara remained constants in each other's lives. They still took evening walks together when weather permitted. They still sat on their porch watching sunsets. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing. The passion of their youth had mellowed into something deeper and richer, a love that had been tested by time and circumstances and had only grown stronger. On a golden September afternoon in 1898, exactly 20 years after they'd married, James and Clara hosted a celebration at the ranch. Their children and grandchildren were there, along with Richard and Rose, now well into their 70s but still active and sharp. Lily and Jack came with their own growing family. Friends and neighbors from all over the territory attended, testament to the respect and affection the Thorntons had earned over the years. As the party wound down and the sun began to set, James found Clara standing alone on the porch of their home, looking out over the land they'd built together. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Happy anniversary, my love," he murmured into her hair. "Happy anniversary." Clara covered his hands with hers, lacing their fingers together. 20 years. Sometimes it feels like forever, and sometimes it feels like just yesterday. "I know exactly what you mean." James turned her in his arms so he could see her face. At 42, Clara was even more beautiful to him than she'd been at 22. Her light brown hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of laughter and sunshine, but her hazel eyes still sparkled with the same spirit that had first captivated him. "You have any regrets?" Clara asked, a question she'd never posed before. James didn't have to think about his answer. "Not a single one. Everything I've ever wanted I have right here. You, our children, this ranch, this life we've built together. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Good, because I don't have any regrets either. Not one." Clara stood on her toes and kissed him, a kiss that held 20 years of love and commitment and partnership. "You saved me, James Thornton. That day behind the general store, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," James corrected gently. "You gave me a purpose, Clara. You gave me a reason to build something lasting. You gave me a family and a home and a love that makes every single day worth living." They stood there on the porch as the stars came out, holding each other and watching their family celebrate below. Samuel was teaching his children to dance while Emma laughed. Rose and her husband were deep in conversation with Richard and Rose. Thomas was entertaining a group with one of his travel stories. The scene was one of joy and life and love, exactly what both James and Clara had dreamed of all those years ago. As the years continued to pass, the Thornton Ranch became one of the most successful in the region. Samuel took over more of the daily operations as James grew older, But James never fully retired. He loved the work too much, loved being out on the land and working with the cattle and horses. Clara remained the heart of the family, the one everyone turned to for advice and comfort and love. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. And then their 40th, both of them grateful for the health and vitality that allowed them to enjoy these milestones together. They watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own, starting the 4th generation of Thorntons on the Wyoming land. On their 50th anniversary, the celebration was smaller but no less meaningful. By then, both James and Clara were in their 70s, their bodies showing the wear of lives fully lived. But their love remained as strong as ever, the foundation that had sustained them through 5 decades of life together. 50 years, Clara marveled as they sat together on their porch, the same spot where they'd spent countless evenings over the years. Who would have thought, that day you found me crying behind the general store, that we'd be sitting here 50 years later? I would have, James said with certainty. From the moment I looked into your eyes and offered you my handkerchief, I knew you were going to change my life. I just didn't know how profoundly. Clara reached over and took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. I was so lost that day, so certain that my life was over, that I had no future. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even thought to pray. You gave me so much, Clara, a wife, a family, a home in every sense of the word. You made me a better man than I ever would have been without you. James brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. I would live these 50 years again in a heartbeat, every joy and every sorrow, just to end up right here with you. They sat in peaceful silence as the sun set over the land they'd built together, over the legacy they'd created. Around them, their family was gathered, spanning 4 generations now. The sound of children's laughter mingled with adult conversation, the scene one of contentment and love. As darkness fell and the stars came out, Clara leaned her head on James's shoulder. Do you remember what you told me that first day? You said things were going to get better. I remember. You were right. Everything got better. Everything got beautiful. Clara closed her eyes, feeling utterly at peace. Thank you, James, for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for helping me when I had no one, for loving me when I felt unlovable. Thank you for 50 years of being exactly who you are. The pleasure and the privilege have been entirely mine, James whispered, holding her close. As they sat together under the stars, surrounded by the family they'd created and the life they'd built, both James and Clara knew they'd been blessed beyond measure. What had started with tears behind a general store and the simple kindness of a handkerchief had blossomed into a love story that would be told by their descendants for generations to come. The young cowboy who'd offered his name and his help to a crying young woman had found not just a wife, but his soulmate. The desperate young woman who'd thought her life was over had found not just security, but a love that gave meaning to every day. Together, they'd built something extraordinary out of ordinary materials. Faith, hard work, commitment, and an unwavering devotion to each other. Their story was one of the Wild West, certainly, with all its hardships and challenges. But more than that, it was a story of the human heart's capacity for love, for resilience, for hope. It was a story that proved that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, and that kindness offered at the right moment can change the course of 2 lives forever. James and Clara Thornton lived several more years, blessed to see the turn of the century and the beginning of a new era. They passed within months of each other, first James and then Clara, both of them surrounded by family and both of them ready to rest after lives well lived. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, under the wide Wyoming sky that had witnessed their love story from beginning to end. On Clara's headstone, beneath her name and dates, James had instructed the words be carved. She gave me hope and home and love eternal. On James's headstone, placed by their children, were the words, He offered his handkerchief and his name and changed one life into two. The ranch continued through the generations, each one adding to the legacy that James and Clara had started. The story of how they met, the cowboy finding the crying young woman behind the general store, became a cherished family tale told to each new generation. It served as a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that kindness and compassion were never wasted. The little house where they'd first lived as newlyweds was preserved and eventually turned into a small museum of sorts, filled with Clara's journals and James's wood carvings and photographs spanning their 53 years together. The handkerchief James had offered Clara that first day was framed and hung on the wall, a tangible reminder of where it all began. And so the story ended where all good love stories should end, with a legacy that lasted beyond the individuals who created it, with love that transcended time and circumstance, with proof that sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person seeing another person's pain and choosing to help. From tears and desperation came joy and fulfillment. From strangers came soulmates. From one small act of kindness came a lifetime of love that echoed through generations. James and Clara's love story became legend in the territory, a reminder during hard times that hope was never truly lost and that tomorrow could bring unexpected blessings. Young couples starting out would visit their graves, paying respects and silently asking for a love as true and lasting. Parents would tell their children the story, teaching them about compassion and kindness and the importance of helping those in need. The land they'd worked so hard to build remained in the family, passed down through Samuel's line and carefully stewarded by each generation. The Thornton Ranch became known not just for the quality of its cattle, but for the integrity of the family that ran it, values instilled by James and Clara and maintained by their descendants. In the end, the story that began on that hot July afternoon in 1878 behind a general store in Cheyenne, Wyoming, became so much more than just a meeting between two people. It became a testament to the power of human connection, to the way one moment of compassion can ripple forward through time, affecting not just two lives but dozens, then hundreds as the generations multiplied. James Thornton had offered his handkerchief to a crying young woman, not knowing he was offering his heart as well. Clara Bennett had accepted that handkerchief, not knowing she was accepting a future filled with more love than she'd ever imagined possible. Together, they'd built a life that honored both where they'd come from and where they were going, never forgetting the difficult beginnings but also never letting those beginnings define their future. Their story proved that the Wild West wasn't just about outlaws and gunfights and hardship, though it certainly had all of those things. It was also about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about building communities and families and legacies in harsh and unforgiving conditions. It was about people like James and Clara, who faced their challenges with courage and faced each other with love, creating something beautiful and lasting in the process. As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, casting long shadows across the Thornton Ranch that had grown from a simple dream into a thriving reality, the legacy of James and Clara lived on. In the laughter of their great-great-grandchildren playing in the same fields where their ancestors had worked. In the solid construction of buildings built to last generations. In the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion that were passed down through each new generation. And most of all, in the enduring reminder that love, true love, the kind that lasts a lifetime and beyond, often begins in the most unexpected ways and grows in the most remarkable directions. The cowboy had found her crying behind the general store. He had offered his handkerchief and his name. And from that simple beginning had come everything that mattered. Love, family, legacy, and a story worth telling for all time.